The men are on their hands and knees in a yard in southern England. It is 1845. They are supposed to be working. Instead, they are fighting over bones, rotting animal bones, decomposing in open air, collected from slaughterhouse yards weeks before. They are fighting for access to the marrow, scraping putrefied flesh with bare fingernails. They have been doing this for months. This is not a prison. This is a government institution built to help the poor. And what is happening in that yard is not a scandal that exposed the system. It is a scandal that finally forced people to look at what the system had always been. This is the Victorian Workhouse, and Andover is not the worst of it. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 did not create poverty relief. It created a deterrent. The men who designed it, Edwin Chadwick principal among them, built the entire system on a single rule called less eligibility. It meant that life inside a workhouse had to be worse, by design, than the hardest, lowest paid existence available outside. Not worse by accident, worse by law. If the workhouse was tolerable, poor people might choose it over low-paid work. That was the problem to be solved. So they engineered something unbearable and called it relief. By the 1840s, more than 600 workhouses were operational across England and Wales. At any given moment, more than 100,000 people were inside them. Not criminals. Widows with no income and children to feed. Orphaned children with nobody left. Men broken by decades in factories who could no longer work. Women whose husbands had died and left nothing. Elderly people at the end of 50 years of labour with nothing to show for it. Critics called these buildings pauper bastilles. They chose the word carefully. A bastille is a prison. You entered because every alternative was gone. You left when the institution decided you could. In between, the institution owned you, your time, your labour, your body, and, as I will come back to, your body after you died. The intake process was designed to strip away identity before you reached the dormitory. Your clothes came off the moment you crossed the threshold. They were replaced with a workhouse uniform, rough grey or blue cloth, stamped with the name of the institution so that if you ran, everyone who saw you would know where you had come from. Some workhouses stored your clothes for discharge, others destroyed them. You were not consulted either way. If you were a woman, your hair was cut on the first day, not trimmed, cropped close to the skull. In Victorian England, a woman's hair carried her dignity, her femininity, her sense of herself. The workhouse removed it on the first morning because the removal was the point. It was not incidental to intake. It was part of it. Then your family was divided. Every family entering was split into 4 wards. Men, women, older boys, younger children. Husbands to one side of the building, wives to the other, children to separate quarters. In better regulated institutions, you might see your spouse for 20 supervised minutes on a Sunday. In the rest, contact was rarer. Some couples spent years inside the same building and barely spoke again. You could not leave without written permission from the workhouse master. Leaving without authorization was grounds for arrest. Every letter you wrote was opened and read before it could be sent. If the master found it objectionable, it did not leave the building. Refuse work, and you went to the punishment cell. Persist, and a magistrate decided what happened next. Poverty was not the crime. Resisting its management was treated as one. Nothing about the work inside a Victorian workhouse was designed to be productive. Everything about it was designed to be punishing enough that no one outside would voluntarily choose to come in. The first job was oakum picking, old rope salvaged from decommissioned naval ships, soaked in tar and sea salt for years until it hardened close to wire, was distributed to inmates. They unpicked it by hand, fibre by fibre, until it's separated back to raw components sold to the Navy for caulking ship hulls. 10 to 12 hours every day. Bare hands. The tar cut skin on contact. Within days, fingers bled. Within months, medical inspectors visiting workhouses across England documented inmates who could no longer fully straighten their fingers. Tendons had adapted permanently to the work's curled position. The condition was recorded. The task was assigned again the following morning. The second job was bone crushing. Heavy iron rammers ground animal bones, horse, cattle, pig, into dust sold to farms as fertilizer. In theory, the bones were fresh. In practice, as the parliamentary inquiry into Andover revealed in explicit testimony, they arrived weeks after collection from slaughterhouse yards in whatever state they happened to be in, visibly decomposing, producing fetid dust that inmates breathed for hours in enclosed yards with nothing covering their faces. And they were hungry enough to eat those bones. The master, Colin McDougall, had been providing less food than the official allowance and keeping the surplus. Inmates not adequately fed for days were scraping rotting marrow and fighting over access to the most intact specimens. This had been continuing for years before anyone external looked. McDougall was removed from his post. No criminal charges were brought. The third job was stone breaking. Large rocks, iron hammer, reduced to pieces small enough to pass through a metal ring of specified diameter. Road gravel, done outdoors in all weather, in clothing not made for it, with no protective equipment, for no wage. A free labourer doing the same work outside earned 6pence a day. The workhouse version had to be legally worse than 6pence a day. The destruction of joints and hands it caused over time was not a design flaw. It was evidence that the policy was functioning. The official diet was a legal document called a dietary. It specified, by inmate category and day of the week, exactly what was permitted. Gruel, thin porridge, water and a scraping of oatmeal, a piece of bread. On certain days in certain institutions, a portion of boiled meat the size of a matchbox. Sweat pudding in some Sunday menus at the more generous establishments. Vegetables, when they appeared, were boiled beyond texture and most of their nutritional value. Every meal was eaten in silence. Speaking at the table was a punishable offence in the majority of workhouses. Inmates sat in rows, collected their allocation, ate without conversation, and filed out. The silence was not a side effect of the rules. It was a rule. The experience of eating was not permitted to be social. Asking for more was a punishable offence. Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist in 1837, 2 years after the new system came into force. When Oliver holds out his bowl in front of the Board of Guardians and asks for more, the board's reaction, outrage, alarm, the sense that something threatening has just occurred, is not dramatic exaggeration. Dickens had visited these places. The workhouse was not malfunctioning when it punished Oliver for asking. The allocation was the policy. Wanting more than the policy permitted was treated as a challenge to the order the entire system existed to enforce. The workhouse master held near total authority over every person inside. What he was permitted to do was regulated. What he actually did was subject to almost no reliable oversight. Formally, masters could sentence inmates to the refractory ward, a solitary cell, for rule violations. They could reduce rations below the already minimal dietary. They could assign additional hard labour as punishment on top of regular work. They could have inmates committed to prison if classified as ungovernable. All legal. All requiring paperwork reviewed by a board of guardians that met infrequently and received most of its information from the master being reviewed. Beyond the formal structure, documented physical abuse appears persistently in parliamentary select committee reports and coroner's court records throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Beatings of inmates were recorded. Children were struck. Cases of sexual abuse of female inmates by workhouse masters and male staff appear in the parliamentary record, reaching formal inquiry only because a death or an unexplained pregnancy made concealment impossible. The structural conditions for this abuse were built into the system from the start. An inmate who reported mistreatment risked immediate punishment for making allegations against staff. Inspectors visited infrequently, often with prior notice, and received most of their information from the master they were nominally checking. MacDougall at Andover was not an anomaly. He was the predictable product of a system that gave one person unchecked power over hundreds of legally captive people and reviewed him on paperwork he produced himself. What was unusual about Andover was not what happened inside it. It was that it became impossible to ignore. Beds were shared, 2 or 3 inmates to a single mattress, rotating through the hours so it was never empty and never aired. Tuberculosis spread through dormitories with systematic efficiency. Cholera arrived in recurring waves. Typhus, dysentery, and ringworm were endemic features rather than periodic crises. In the worst years in the worst institutions, the annual mortality rate exceeded 10%. The communities surrounding certain workhouses had a name for them: death houses. But dying there was not what inmates feared most. The Anatomy Act of 1832. 2 years before the New Poor Law created the modern workhouse, Parliament passed legislation to solve a crisis in medical education. Surgical training depended on cadavers. Cadavers came from grave robbers who dug up fresh burials and sold them to anatomy theatres. The Act ended that trade by giving licensed medical schools the legal right to claim the unclaimed bodies of workhouse inmates who died without a family member coming forward in time. If you died in the workhouse at night, and your wife was in a separate ward of the same building and was not informed until the window had closed, your body could be transferred to a medical school, dissected by students, and buried in an unmarked mass grave. For the Victorian poor, who held specific and genuine beliefs about bodily resurrection and a Christian burial, this was not an administrative inconvenience. It was the worst thing the state could do. Inmates knew about it. They watched bodies leave the building. The workhouse took your dignity in life. The Anatomy Act took your body in death. Both were legal. Both had full parliamentary sanction. Both were deliberate. Children born inside the workhouse were registered as workhouse children. They grew up inside the institution with minimal education. Enough literacy to be employable, not enough to give them options. From around age 9, they could be apprenticed out, assigned to a factory, farm, or household with no negotiation and no parental consent, because parents inside the workhouse had no legal standing to give it. No formal mechanism existed for complaint if the placement became abusive. The legal term was apprenticeship. In many documented cases, the experience was forced child labour with no exit. In 1849, a private establishment in Tooting contracted by multiple London workhouses to house their children was struck by cholera. 180 children died in a single outbreak. An inquest found the facility so overcrowded and so deficiently provisioned that the mortality was foreseeable. Dickens reported on it personally in the Examiner and described it as systematic child murder. The operator, Bartholomew Peter Drouet, was tried for manslaughter. He was acquitted. Unmarried mothers were publicly marked. In a number of workhouses, they were required to wear dresses in a designated colour, yellow in some institutions, red in others, identifying them as fallen women in every communal space at all times. Chapel, dining hall, workrooms. The explicit purpose, recorded in policy documents, was to separate them from the respectable poor, and to make that separation visible and constant, every hour of every day. The elderly had no special category and no protected provision. A person arriving at 70 after 50 years of work was processed identically to every other intake, stripped, uniformed, separated from any family who had come with them, assigned a shared bed in a disease-circulating dormitory, given gruel, given silence, and left to reach whatever end the institution permitted. The decades outside counted for nothing once they were through the door. There is something documented across the historical record of Victorian workhouses that does not fit into policy language or mortality tables, and that most accounts of the period never mention. Inspectors, reformers, and journalists who visited these buildings wrote about a sound, not in official reports. The format had no category for it. In private letters, in the margins of inspection notes, in personal accounts published briefly and largely forgotten. The accounts are independent, different people, different institutions, different counties, spanning 30 years. They describe the same thing. They called it the workhouse wail. Not crying, not screaming. Described consistently as a low, collective, continuous sound, somewhere between a prolonged moan and an exhalation, heard in dormitories after dark and in workrooms during the day, coming from groups of women required to be silent who were not quite silent. One inspector writing in the 1840s noted he had heard something like it once before. A slaughterhouse, he wrote, in the period before the animals understood what was about to happen. The workhouse wail appears across too many independent accounts, over too many years, to be one writer's embellishment. What it documents is the effect of sustained institutional cruelty on a person after active resistance has ended, when the mind is no longer constructing a protest and the body continues producing a sound on its own. Not despair in any active sense, something that has moved past despair. The sound of a person who has stopped fighting and has not stopped breathing. The last Victorian workhouse in Britain closed in 1948, when the National Health Service came into existence and absorbed its functions. The system had been operational for 114 years. 114 years of families divided at the intake door, of men scraping rotting marrow from decomposing bones, of women wearing coloured dresses as daily public punishment, of children assigned to factories at 9 years old, of bodies transferred to anatomy schools in the night, of the sound in the dormitories. The Andover scandal produced an inquiry and a sequence of reforms. Adjustments were made. The less eligibility principle remained. The deliberate humiliation of intake remained. The near total authority of the master over legally captive people remained. Because this was not a system that had drifted into cruelty through neglect. Every element of it had been designed, defended in Parliament, and maintained across 11 decades as deliberate policy. The Victorian state looked at the most desperate people in the country and decided that the appropriate response to poverty was to make it hurt. It built 600 institutions to deliver that. It staffed them, funded them, and called them poor relief. If this gave you something you did not have before, subscribe. Every week we go into the history that gets left out, the parts that are harder to look at and more important to understand. Subscribe, and you will not miss what comes next.